Thank you. Wait,
Yo.
what? Oh, yes. Recording is in progress.
That's
Good.
just the Zoom recording, not the Facebook recording.
Gotcha. All right. That's awesome. Let me pray and then we'll make some rules up as always. Father, thank you very much for this group that comes here faithfully most every Tuesday and those who are able to join us tonight as special occasions. We're grateful that you give us the time to hang out together. Lord, I do pray that this community group would be a community, that we would be gentle and kind to one another. We'd think well. And most of all, at least I, really want to exalt you in this teaching, in this conversation, discussion. This isn't about our feelings on things. We really want to hear you, and we want to exalt you. So be with us today, please. In Jesus' name, amen.
I got Tuesday school on.
All right, Davin has his microphone on and is talking to somebody else about Tuesday school. So that's a good example there. Thanks, Dav, because that's what I was about to say. If you've got a microphone, you're fine. If you got a microphone, please mute it until you want to say something. That's just really helpful to us. I'm looking around and I'm seeing at least one, two, three people two people that are maybe three people still are not muted. That would be really helpful. And then just come on anytime you want. And usually I'll see your microphone go off, and I'll pause or something like that. But feel free to just interrupt me wherever you want to, and I'll do my best. But try and keep it on mute otherwise, just because background noise and stuff like that. Okay, so here's the list of rules for what we're doing. Just a reminder, we are. Let me take you back in my world. So for 4 years since we've been doing this, people have been asking me to talk about this subject. So some with great regularity, and I have continued to put them off for years, mainly because I was just unwilling to read the books on the subject and think through the issues, because of the world that I live in is very conservative, and I didn't want to have an answer. I wanted to be able to say I don't have an answer on this, and I'm still good. And here's where I'm going to conclude. I'm not sure I've got an answer on this. Okay. So if you think you're coming here and you're going to hear from Jace as if he has all the answers, which I don't think anybody is at this point, you're going to be sorely mistaken. But I think that I can do what people have asked me to do and lead a conversation around this topic, and deal with the texts and kind of point us when we're not being completely fair to the text, and then maybe show a little bit of wisdom as we get through this. That's really my only goal. I have spent the last 6 months or so reading. I've got a stack of books that I read and a stack that I listened to, and taking notes and thinking through all these things. So I've got a lot more opinions now, and a lot more thinking on it, but this is not going to be a scholarly conversation. I fully recognize that every verse that we're going to deal with, I have like 10 sentences written down, when multiples of dozens and thousands probably of books have been written on each one of these things. So I'm going to just barely scratch the surface. Think of this as me writing a chapter in something that's a multi-volume book, and the chapter is enough to give you a big broad picture. Okay, so don't come in here expecting too much. I'm going to do a lot of conversations that thank you. I'm going to do a lot of conversations that I'm going to say, here's how scholars talk about this. And I don't know what they're getting right and what they're getting wrong in all of this, because I only am able to do so much work on this. I'm giving a lot of caveat to this, because as I go in here, you're going to be like, yeah, but maybe you know something more than I do. Oh, wait. So I meant to say this before. Thank you, Travis, for mentioning this to me as well just now. Just a little reminder, someone in our group that you guys probably remember has been here pretty regularly for the last year or so, Trisha Dowdy. The reason that I'm in a tie actually today, and a suit is what I was in all day, is she died last week. And so I did her funeral. So one of our group's not here with us, and I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I think that this group is, for many, has become a community. Some people don't go to church, they just come to this. Not that I approve of that, but this is their community of people. And so Trisha meant a lot to some of us. So I just wanted to bring that up. Okay, back to this. we're going to have this conversation. You're going to talk a lot, I'm sure. I don't know how much in the first session, but you're going to talk a lot. Remember that the 25 people that you see right now, which you can't see any more than that because that's how the screen works, I think, some of those people might not only disagree with you, might be completely left or completely right on the subject, but also as to who they are, right? There might be people here that are LGBTQ, et cetera, right? That are somewhere in this phase in their sexuality, wherever that is. So please be careful how you say things. You can be direct. You can say, I think this is wrong. You don't have to caveat every sentence with, just so you know, I love, but just do it in your head. Caveat it in your head. I love these people. They're people just like me. We're going to talk about all of this stuff as we get in here. And on the other side, you got this. I want to make sure that curiosity on the subject is not rebellion against God. Okay, if you are a strict conservative here, and you just want I'm open. That's not rebellion. That's faithfulness. Okay? That means you're willing to listen to people who disagree with you and think differently about that. I don't think any of us should be content with the status quo. I hope that I've been showing that constantly. I had a conversation with a scholarly friend on the way home from work this evening at 7:00. And we were talking about because we were basically teenagers in early 20s together, and he's now a scholar, a big name scholar who writes about all this stuff. And we were just talking about curiosity and faithfulness and not being content, and how much we wish he could go back and change a lot of the things that we believed. Let's go back and say, I'm really sorry that I taught this 10, 20, 30 years ago. So we want to honestly look at the texts. That's what we do here. This is not just for Christians. This is for people who want to look at the Bible and understand it. So you don't even have to have a faith commitment to come and hang out with us. The class exists not to win a culture war. If you're here to win something, please just go ahead and just say goodbye. Like we're not trying to win anything. We're just trying to have honest, humble conversations. We don't want to shame anyone. We are going to mess up our language sometimes, and hopefully you'll just have grace on us. Right? We're going to say it wrong, say it in some offensive way that we didn't mean to. Please just have grace. We don't want to flatten scripture. That's been a major emphasis all along. We don't want the scripture to say, if it said it in Genesis, it says it in Revelation, and that there's no diversity in there. We want to be open to a multivocal text that speaks with lots of different voices. And so we want to hear those voices, and we want to understand what the Bible's actually doing before we try to apply it to ourselves. We're not going to apply it here. That's not our job. That's the job of the church and for you personally. In fact, if you are cruel, or if you're just saying anything that Sarah doesn't even like that much, she has agreed that she's just going to turn you off. She's going to cut you right out. So she has the power to do that. So whatever you do, kiss up to Sarah. That's the only way that you're going to be able to say anything. So recognize the limits of this group, please, when it comes to scholarship. This is a 2 or 3 session class that, again, multi-volumes have been written on. So just recognize that and ask yourself as you come in, what if I'm wrong? What if what I've believed is wrong, and I've got something else to learn? Hopefully we always do that when we come in here. What can I learn from others? Even if I'm right, is there something that can be changed in my thinking? Or is there grace that I can show in a different way? Maybe you could just practice humble question asking, or phrasing questions in a way instead of just making your statement. Whatever that is, do whatever you need to do that. But again, let me emphasize I'm going to be trying to argue what scholars have said in many books, and not pretend that I'm an expert on the subject. Okay, I don't think anybody in here is, although I have somebody who has written on this coming either next week or the week after to do a talk on it for us, which I thought would be super fun. So people have been hitting me up about this kind of stuff. So now I'm like, okay, why don't you come and talk? After I introduce all of this, you can come and we can put them in anywhere, just kind of stick them in. So here is how I want to start this. We can start just by looking at a verse, but I want to start a little bit further back. I want to say this statement that I think probably we're all going to be okay with. The Bible doesn't speak about homosexuality as we understand it today. Okay, this is going to be one of the key theses that I'm trying to make here. It speaks about sexual acts, for sure, embedded in ancient power structures, in purity systems, and in social hierarchies. That's a little different than what we understand. So confusing these categories is going to lead to misunderstanding both scripture and people. Okay, so that's just kind of my key thesis here as we jump in, and we're going to get some context of the world that they live in and the world that we live in. And then with that context firmly implanted in our head, we're going to look at verses and take that context in with us. So there's probably some things that we need to think through to begin with. So are you guys ready? Anybody have anything they need to say to get off their chest to start this off? Woo, let's go. Finally, I'm ready. All right. All right, Mandy's ready. Okay. Here's where we go. First thing I wanted to say is that this is not the homosexuality is not an ancient category, right? That's the main emphasis that I want to get. It's the modern category of homosexuality is recent and not biblical. So when we talk about homosexuality, we're talking about something different than the Bible is talking about. That's pretty important to all of us. Okay, and I'm going to show you some of that as we go through this. But what a lot of people talk about in the world of cognitive sciences is what we'll term the ick factor. You know the ick factor? Things that disgust you end up becoming taboos for communities. Okay, so if you don't like something, and then you get a group of people around you who don't like something, that becomes a community taboo. And that's just, these are the things we don't like together. So we need to be careful about taboos that work around disgust sensitivity. That's how psychologists talk about this disgust sensitivity. So what happens is we have feelings of disgust, and they get heightened by our community around us. The majority of people feel the same way. And now we have this social rationalization. All right, let's see, Josh Patterson, ick factor, eucontamination, disgust theology in the Christian life. Fantastic. All right, so there's a book that he's just thrown out to us. We get this because the community agrees with us. Then now we have social rationalization, and we have reinforcement, and that leads into what we've been talking a lot in our Bible hermeneutics, right? Is it leads into our preconceptions, our presuppositions, and then we start reading the Bible with that stuff in our mind. Okay, so sometimes I like to start our Bible studies making sure that we already know our presuppositions and maybe working them a different way, like when we talked about females in leadership, right? Instead of starting with those couple of verses that Paul talks about, or it's not even Paul, but in Timothy, we started way earlier. We started in the Old Testament. We worked our way up. So by the time we got to Paul, we were almost like, Paul doesn't have a chance of winning this. And then we realized Paul might not be saying exactly what we think he's saying, right? That's somehow how we do that. So anyway, the way to change your disgust factors and to not let you rely on those is actually to get to know people who have a different orientation than you do. It's amazing how that works. And I know this probably isn't profound for anybody here, or maybe it is for a couple people. Like maybe you need to actually hang out with people who have sex with the same part with, same sex union there. So, and it's easy for us now to see that different world. Think about Israel, though, right? They've got a small community. They all have a taboo about something, right? Don't touch pork, for instance, or make sure that mold, everyone agrees mold is evil, shellfish is evil. And then that just continues to pile up. More and more people believe that. So now we're all disgusted in those things. And so the stories start to be told about those things. It's a very small group. They're not hearing from Egypt very much. Certainly not hearing from the Native Americans, right? At that time, the people living on all these different continents. So they're living in a very small group that mostly agrees with them about the way they think about things. So the concept of homosexuality is one today of orientation and identity. You guys know this. This is is it 1868? An 1868 coined word. Before that, there is no such thing as homosexuality. I don't mean that there weren't sex acts that took place. I mean, there was nothing like what we call a modern definition of homosexuality. This is a 19th century thing that is a proclivity to sex, to same sex. Like you have an orientation. You're drawn that way. You're attracted to that. They didn't think that way. At least most people didn't think that way back then. So this is a lot broader than the Bible. This is just the culture in general. And even if someone, like for instance, has never had sex before, they would be condemned if the Bible was talking about this view of homosexuality, of orientation. The Bible's not doing that. It's not talking about orientation. It doesn't have that in mind. It doesn't think that way. It does, I think I'm going to argue, I think it does condemn same-sex acts, at least some places. We still have to wrestle with it. There's a lot to wrestle with. Just because I said that word, those words, doesn't mean that, okay, well, good, I've got the answer. Not at all.
Are
I
you
think
saying
it does.
Are you saying particularly like sodomy?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And we all even have to talk about that word, which is, goes back to Sodom, which has nothing to do with it, but that's the word that's come up. So when we say that the Bible is going to say no to same-sex intercourse, we're going to have to contextualize each of these texts, right? We have to deal with each one on their own and figure out what they're trying to say, because some of them might be saying, yes, in this context you can't do that. This context we don't know anything about. We've never even heard of this context. But here's what you're not allowed to do in this context that they are thinking about. So it's possible, or is it possible, that maybe some of these ideas that the Bible has, even, these are the questions that we're going to ask usually in our last section together, that they're outdated. Okay? Even people who hold to the Bible as authority might argue that there are some texts that are outdated, right? That we don't follow the same way, or as Hebrews says, that Jesus has abolished it. As Matthew says, that Jesus has fulfilled it. I don't think any of you stone your children for dishonoring you. I'm pretty sure none of you burn your house down if you find mold in it. You just put some Clorox on it and deal with it. Right? I'm guessing that all of you are wearing clothes with mixed fabrics and plant two seeds and, whatever. Like all these things that are consistent throughout the Bible, we consider them outdated. What if this is one of those things? These are just the questions that we need to ask. Like what we've done here, we've talked about slavery. I think the Bible is relatively consistent on slavery. Maybe it lightens it up a little bit as it goes, but there's no way that Paul would be like, nope, we shouldn't have any slaves. I don't think. Or females in leadership. Maybe there's been movement. Maybe those ideas are outdated. So we have modern ideas and we like to impose them on the ancient text. So the biblical, so that's the modern understanding, right? Orientation, identity, proclivity towards, not talking about action, just talking about your orientation, who you are. I am born this way. I'm attracted to people that are just like me. So they, in the biblical world, don't have a concept of orientation. That's not the way they think. They only think in regards to acts. Now we're gonna go a little bit deeper than this, but acts is the only thing that generally is understanding. Acts and the acts come in different ways, like in regard to purity. What are the purity rules that people have around the actions that they take? What about the hierarchy? Who's in charge in regard to the actions they take? Right? Males or females or animals or whatever else, demons, whatever, wherever there's a hierarchy. It's all, remember, the Bible's all about order. We're going to talk about that a lot. It's not usually about morals as much as it's about order, and morals comes from the order that they would have understood at that time. So order is important to this. Domination and submission. Okay, who's in the position of domination, who's in the position of submission matters a lot in their world. So much more than ours, because we don't live in an honor-shame culture. They did. So they think in terms of this person being here and somebody else being here. We like to think of all people being equal. That's our little American thing, but they don't think that way. Okay, so here's a way for us to think about the ancient sexual worldview. We're going to get to the text very soon. This is all just kind of intro, and then you can throw in whatever you want before we jump into the text. But we need to think of sex, and maybe you already do in this way, but we need to think about sex as power and not as lust or love. Okay, that would have been more the way that they would have talked about it. It's not intimacy, it's a power play. Now, it can still be enjoyable, it can still be intimate, don't get me wrong, but there is always someone in power in the situation. Okay, this isn't an intimate equals coming together. That's not the way most people would have thought of sex back then. Okay, and you might argue a lot of people don't think about it that way now, right? It might still be this toxic masculinity. Anybody, right? Like rape, anybody who thinks rape is just about lust is probably missing most of what rape is, right? It's mostly a power play. Or if you think, the men in the Old Testament that would take the captive daughters and things like that, it's because, well, these are just my spoils. I get to have sex. Isn't this great? I get to take these women. That's not what it was about. It was about humiliation and shame and showing themselves as greater. We have conquered, right? It's a power play. And sex is often a power play even among like intimate couples, unfortunately. That's horrible, but it is that way sometimes. But for them, for sure, it was always understood about who's on top and hierarchy. And I mean that both like euphemistic, like metaphorically on top, but also literally. That has a lot to do with it, is even their positions. Are you guys going to be able to handle this? Everybody's an adult here. Even the positions that they have in the bedroom are important to the way they thought about sexuality. So it was generally understood that men would be on top because of the hierarchy, but also they would be on top physically in the sex act. They needed to be on top because men are the penetrators, women are the penetrated. And you've probably heard this from certain pastors. I have, even recently, even in the last decade, I've heard people saying these kinds of things, right? But that's the way that people back then would have thought. Sex was a picture of reality. Sex was a question of power. Sex wasn't about intimacy. It was mostly about control. That's how they would have thought about things. In the ancient world, they didn't think often of two mutually agreeing people coming together. It was generally about something being done to somebody. There was a hierarchy. It may have been acquiesced, they may have agreed, they may have enjoyed all of those things, but there's still a hierarchy in the way it works. Okay, so let me give you 3 texts in the culture just to give you some of that cultural background. Okay, this one is an omen text. Like a bad omen, an owl that flies over. This is an omen text in the Mesopotamian culture. So they have these sex omens. And this is the first millennium BCE. So this is 3,000 years ago. Okay, this text comes out. And it says this: if a woman mounts him, that woman will take his vigor. For 1 month, he will not have a personal god. Okay, now that sounds really weird. You're trying to put all that together. I didn't show it on the screen, so you can't think about it. So I'm just saying, if a woman mounts him, that woman will take his vigor. For 1 month, he will not have a personal god. So basically, if you're on the bottom, then you lose your sexual god. You lose your power. You lose your vitality, your vigor. Following this? So women do not get to be on top in ancient Mesopotamia, right? You lose all your power, men, if that happens. Men cannot be in the submissive position, and submissive position means under. That's what it meant. Now, this is 3,000 years ago. Our culture's different. We don't think that way. This is the way they would have thought. But this is closer to the world of the Bible, right? Or maybe not technically close. Yeah, no, it's definitely closer. Probably 500 years away instead of 2,500 years. This is the way they're thinking. The Talmud in Gittin, the Babylonian Talmud at least, says this. And this Talmud is going to be not in our millennium, but it's going to be probably like medieval. In the first probably 4 centuries or so, some parts of this are being written and put together Talmud is part of what we call oral Torah, which is interesting that it's written. But it starts out as oral Torah, then it gets written down, and they still call it oral Torah, but it's written. And it says this: if you're on the bottom, you will be stricken with, let's see. Oh no, here's how it goes. She above and he below, afflicted with dalaria. Dalaria is the word. So if she is above and he is below, dalaria. And most scholars would say that dalaria could be translated as diarrhea. So this is the conviction. This is what happens to you if you are on the bottom, men. You're to be. The diarrhea is coming. Okay, this is one of their sex omens. And here is the alphabet of Ben Sira, which is like probably somewhere in the 800s Common Era. We don't know exactly, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Common Era. So again, this is a late text, right? This is not near the Bible, but it's a lot further back than ours. And it says, it begins in Genesis 1:27. It says, the first human was single, but two sexes. Okay, so it's explaining the Genesis parts, and this is what a lot of the text around there they'll put in the gaps. They'll fill in the gaps of this time. So he says the first human was single, but two sexes, and then divided into two separate beings when Eve is taken from his side. Right, that's the rib thing. We call it a rib, but it just means side. Right, so when mankind is separated, but what the alphabet of Ben Sira is going to say is there's a story before Adam being separated into two and there being Adam and Eve. There's a woman that comes before this time. Before Eve, God created the first woman from the dust of the ground. And this woman wasn't suitable for Adam. There was a problem that was going on there. And the problem, according to chapter 78, is that Lilith and Adam immediately began to argue because Lilith didn't want to lie below. She didn't want to be on the bottom. And Adam said, you are only fit for being below. And she was saying, I'm fit for being above. So Lilith insists they're equal. I should get to be above sometimes. We go back and forth in the sexual act kind of thing. And so she's pretty ticked off in her insistence, storms out of the Garden of Eden. God sends angels after her. She doesn't come back. And so Eve is the wrap up for that. We're going to give Eve, and I assume Eve was very submissive and was always on the bottom.
What was
All
the
right,
reference for that?
This is alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith, chapter 78.
So it's not the Bible.
Oh no, yeah, I'm giving none of this is the Bible.
Okay.
Yeah, I gave you a Mesopotamian text and the Babylonian Talmud and the alphabet of Ben Sira. None of these are biblical. They're just comments on the Bible. Well, the second two were. The first one was before that. So this is just to give you a cultural understanding of the way other people in different places think about sexuality. Not everyone thinks about it in 2025 language or thinking on things, right? We're all a little bit different. So the implications. Men can't be passive. That would have been their rule. You can't be passive. Men, you're aggressive. You're the aggressor. You're active. You're the one acting. And of course, because of this, same sex would not have made sense to them. Right? Because you can't have two people that are both aggressors. So if man is supposed to be an aggressor and then there's another man, somebody has to be submissive. Whoever's submissive, there's a problem. This doesn't fit. It makes perfect sense if it's a woman because she's supposed to be submissive, right? And there's a hierarchy here, an order. So they can't do this. So men are dominant. Males did sex to people. It was about an active sexual agent doing something to a passive sexual object. And you see this in the Bible, even in the language the Bible uses. Men took women, right? That's a normal way that they talk about that because that's what they did. They took women. And lots of verbs to describe that. Women weren't generally given choices. They weren't, sometimes people are like, women are property. That's too far to say that women were property, but they weren't men, right? So they were definitely submissive, forced submission, not just naturally submissive. Like sometimes that's just going to happen in a relationship and that's fine. But men are higher up on the penetration scale, and men can't be submissive. It violates their whole social status. And so people couldn't see them as men. And if you're not man, what are you? And that's the confusion there. So they can't be on the bottom of the culture or on the bottom of sex. He can't receive, he must penetrate, et cetera, et cetera. So loving, mutual, same-sex relationships were relatively invisible. That's just not the way relationships worked back then. And you can see this even if you like period pieces, like Netflix period piece, and you go back and you see, why did the women get married? They got married for status or for protection or like, well, you know, this guy will be okay, I guess. It's not love. That's just the whole Disney entrance to things, right? Where we just all just fall in love and everything's great. Well, there's a reason for doing this. So we know that relationships aren't always the same, even in other cultures now, where, you know, they just agree to get married. The fathers set it up for the next generation. There are different ways to think about these things, and they would have thought about them differently. Biblical authors would not have thought about the same-sex relationships as relationships at all. That wouldn't be considered a relationship. They were cultic, authoritative, exploitative, abusive, deviant, one-off encounters, not loving, monogamous, committed, romantic, etc. So I'm not sure the Old Testament writers, I'm not sure Paul, I don't know that they could even conceive. This might be going too far, but go with me. I don't know that they could even conceive of homosexuality as we define it today. That just doesn't make sense that people would be in a good relationship where they raise children together. They just, like what? That's not what we're talking about when we talk about same-sex acts, right? We disagree with that, but it's not what you guys are talking about, because that doesn't really exist, or at least not often. So there were Greek relationships, but it wasn't common. And even then, there was some superior and some inferior going on there. So Paul would have just dismissed any such relationships as aberrations, not a desire for the same things that heterosexual couples wanted. I only have a few lines here before we get into the text. So men are looking for receptive, submissive roles, and that doesn't make sense to them. So in their world, something would have been wrong with any man who is looking for a receptive role. There's something wrong with that person. If you ask them why they might do that, they just wouldn't even have it. They would not be able to conceive of such a thing. Greco-Roman period Judaism at the time, Philo even calls this the feminizing disease, right? That there were men who wanted the receptive role, and he called it the feminizing disease. Something was pathologically wrong with them. This is a dysfunction in their brain. And actually, it's not that long ago, even in our own culture, that would have been the case, that this would have been a dysfunction. And I hear it sometimes in very conservative circles are saying that now. So keep in mind, I'm not trying to lead you in any direction, even as I'm saying this. I'm just trying to give you some of the background here so you recognize today's thing is not exactly what their thing is. And we can't automatically put ours on there.
So the stay-at-home mom is just off the table. And back.
Say that again?
The stay-at-home mom is off the table.
Right, exactly. Yeah. All right, so there wasn't a concept of mutual, versatile sexual intercourse. People of same status didn't do this. It was so transgressive that ancient authorities had trouble figuring out how it could even happen. Of course, men would want what they would call soft bodies. We're going to get to that. Arkansoita is coming up later on, the Greek word. Because men are looking for things to penetrate. That sounds terrible, but that is, I mean, it would make sense that men would think that way to them, but they can't explain why anybody would want the other role. And the only explanation is that the men were inferiors, they were assaulted, they were feminized somehow pathologically. Something had warped their brain into this diseased state that it was. Women were largely ignored because they were passive sexual objects that didn't have relevant agency anyway, and female same-sex was ignored because there's no penetration, so it doesn't matter. And you're going to see this from the Bible. When we look at these texts, you're going to see a lot of things about men and almost nothing about women. And the things that you do see about women are going to be in relationship to animals, because that's the only hierarchy, right? Because women have things done to them, not with them. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying this is the culture that they lived in. So Paul and others of that time could not have been commenting on what we see today. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't come up with an application. Doesn't mean we can't go back to the Old Testament, follow it into the New Testament, actually use hermeneutical principles, come up with theology, and move into our world. That is still possible to do. I just don't want us to automatically say, well, Paul says here that they shouldn't lie together. Done. Like, that's it. Therefore, it's clear. And a lot of people, even on my Facebook page, like, it's crystal clear what the Bible says about this. I don't know that that's quite so fair. Okay. I do think. Go ahead.
Is it fair to say, like, this idea that, like, sex was a certain way, love was a certain way, like, culturally, societally, maybe so, but, like, there's going to be exceptions, right? Like, even, like, ancient origins, like, there's an idea of, like, pair bonding and people being together. Like, sure, like, culturally, the idea of romantic love doesn't come until, like, the early Middle Ages, maybe.
It's troubadours.
But,
Yeah,
like,
it's
I
13th
feel
century.
like, are we drawing too big of a blanket, or?
Yeah. For sure, I'm putting things into an easy to understand categories as if this is like a blanket understanding of everything. There are exceptions to everything that we're going to say, right? So that's why I gave all those caveats at the beginning. This is not scholarly. If we were doing it scholarly, we would say, 87% of the society, da 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 da, and he got these. This is big picture kinds of ideas in order to create in you a humility when you come to the text to realize that your view isn't necessarily their view. We can't just equalize these things and put them together, which we should not do in any area, right? 2,000 years have gone by since Jesus's time. 2,500 years since any Old Testament, right? A little longer. At least 2,200 maybe for Daniel, whatever. So that's all I'm trying to do is create, like, there's a different cultural context for how they would have thought about things. So it would be fair for you to say something like, Paul has nothing to say about homosexuality at all. That'd be a fair statement. Now, hopefully you wouldn't leave it there. You'd say, well, homosexuality is a new word. It means something very different than it meant back then. He does have something to say about acting two males being together. He does have something to say about that, which we're going to deal with. Just not in the same way that we think about it today. Go ahead, Josh. Sorry, microphone.
Well, I think he also has something to say in Ephesians about 4, 5, and 6 about Christian living in the family unit, and he's quoting Genesis, and so he's looking back at how God's designed. Now, this is not necessarily my view, but how God's designed us and the nuclear family, and so there's a hierarchy there, and so it's not just his condemning. Well, the word homosexual didn't come into play until the 19th century, but it's not just his Paul talking about homosexual acts, but it's also talking about the family. And I think, let me just make sure I'm catching you, getting you clear, is that ancient wisdom would say that effeminate men and like the Mr. Mom ideal is a disease. It's not necessarily something that's frowned upon, but it's actually something that's mentally, it's a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying by pathologically that they're yeah.
Right. And so our culture has totally shifted. We don't look at this way anymore. Women work, men are effeminate, and they stay at home with their children. And so it's hard to even think like they would think. And so
Right.
it's really difficult to put ourselves in their shoes. And so things have changed drastically.
Yeah. Very good word. Yep. And before anybody else comments, let me comment on something else you said in there, which is very important. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at what some people call the clobber texts, right? So we're going to walk through these texts that may or may not have to do with homosexuality. But what we're not going to do is walk through the whole story, the history of redemption that the Bible is portraying, and look at all the texts that positively portray a family. So somebody might be able to come and say, look, maybe these texts say one thing, but look at the sweep of history in Scripture and how it starts with Adam and Eve, right? Not Adam and Steve, for instance. Or it starts with this kind of thing. And that should be our way of thinking from here on out. We aren't going to go through all that except for in big picture, broad language like this. Otherwise, we're basically starting in Genesis and we're reading every verse and we're all going to be dead before we get to the points. So we're just trying to do the big picture kinds of stuff here, and these texts that we think say for sure this. And I'm going to show, maybe not for sure, but you might have a point. All right, keep going. Somebody else who wants to.
I'm going to be quiet after this, but I want to also talk about the Second Timothy chapter 2 passage where we talked about the woman being cursed for childbirth with childbirth, and so this ideal or this conception of a woman being pregnant and being a nurturer of the children and staying at home. This idea of a woman his job and her mental and chemical makeup, her mental chemical makeup is more this way. To me, and I'm not sexist, I'm not a chauvinist. It just rings true that in our society, when I see women who are working, and this is going to get me in trouble. And I had some jokes earlier when you were talking about sex, and I just refrained because it's like, oh my goodness, like, yeah, I have to refrain because this is a sensitive subject. But it seems as if that it's not a curse, but it seems as if it's designed that way. If one were to look objectively at the way it's working, it works out. It's the man's stronger, meant to go out and work. So it seems to be that this is arguably the design. Now, women are very capable of working. I think it's wonderful that they work. I just want to caveat what I just said. It just make sure everyone knows I'm not chauvinistic.
And we talked a lot about this women in leadership kind of question and what is obvious, right, to us. That men are a certain way, it looks like by design. God makes them bigger and stronger and faster, blah, 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 blah. And how that shifts. And we're going to talk about that for sure in this conversation a lot too. So as to whether people are just seeing things and then they're bringing that into their theology, right? Does not nature itself tell you that men should not wear something on their heads, right? Like those kinds of things. Does not nature? And you want to say, no, Paul, nature doesn't tell us that. Maybe in your time that's what nature told us because that's what your community all thought, but it doesn't tell us that at all, right? Men wear all kinds of different hair. Women wear all kinds of different hair. It has nothing to do with anything. Why would you come up with that as a theological argument for something? So, and that comes to the disgust factor too, that Josh quoted, gave us that book for, right? Well, yeah, of course. For years, we all thought, because we all lived, at least those of us who grew up in the 80s, and we just made homosexual jokes every other minute, and we all lisped and, walked effeminately or whatever it was that we do. Like, that's just the world that we lived in, right? And so it was obviously wrong. Obviously. Not quite so obvious now in a new culture. And so we do have to look at the Bible and say, what does the Bible say? Or do we just change it, reimagine it, renegotiate it every generation for something new? And we do talk a lot about reimagining and renegotiating here because we have to. I mean, I think even Jesus did that a little bit. But we want to be careful. We want to have good hermeneutics too. Anybody else got stuff to add here? All right, let's open the Bible. We got enough time to do at least a verse or two. Leviticus. We'll start with the first one. Well, kind of the first one. We'll come back to the Sodom and Gomorrah passage a little bit later. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 22 and 23. It says this: You shall not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. It's an abomination. Or if I were to translate it more literally, I might say something like this: And with a male, you shall not lie the lyings of a woman. It is an abomination. That's a really weird way of saying something. That's why we don't translate it that way. Don't lie the lyings of a woman. And scholars debate as to whether this is a sweeping prohibition or a condemnation of some specific historically situated practices, right? But it certainly is saying it's not certainly saying that. Maybe we need to see the exegesis here. So the lie the lyings of a woman only appears in these Leviticus passages that I'm going to show you. Most agree that it derives from the phrase lyings of a male. And so the lyings of a woman come from the lyings of a male, which can be found in two other passages, which I'll give you right now. Are you ready? Numbers chapter 31:17 and Judges 21:11 through 12. And both of these passages are about regular sleeping around, like regular sex, in the Bible's way of thinking about what regular is, about a woman sleeping with a man. So Numbers 31 says, we don't need all the context of this. I just want you to see the translation. Now kill all the boys. It's a great way to start a verse, right? Straight up. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man. That's the same phrase. Who have the lyings of a male there. So it's a woman who slept with a man. And Judges says they found among people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. So I think all that to just say, I think the translation that we had, you shall not lie with mankind as with womankind, is an abomination, is a decent translation. Okay, that's, and by the way, if people ever say, when they're talking about the Bible, you get a pastor say, well, the Hebrew actually says, be leery. Okay, because the people who translate these texts are smart. They're usually smarter than your pastor. Okay, they just are. So just be careful. I mean, sometimes it's right. Sometimes they need to have done a better job with the translation. But usually the translation means exactly what you see it in the NIV or the King James, whatever. It's usually pretty close. We've done all that work before too. All right, so that's what it means. The word ta'avah is like for abomination. That's actually usually predominantly a cultic word. It's dealing with something that is ritually unclean or impure. So it doesn't usually mean it's a sin in the highest category, like what an abominable sin. That's not what's talking about here. It's talking about like not an act of intrinsic evil. It's talking about something that's ritually unclean or impure, which is a world that they lived in, and especially in Leviticus 18. So let's remember where Leviticus 18 and 22, which we're going to get to, I don't think today, but soon. These are what are called, they're parts of the holiness code. So this is a very specific group of texts that exist. I think it's like, I don't know, I can't remember what the chapters, anybody could Google it real quick, but it's like 10 chapters in Leviticus, like 16 through 22 or 27 or something like that. I can't remember what it is. It'll be 10 seconds before somebody proves what it is. But it has all of these prohibitions in it that honestly we're gonna have to fight really hard if we want to think that these are going to be for us today. All these kinds of prohibitions, all the dietary laws, they're in there. All the prohibitions against wearing clothes of mixed fabric are in there. And so, like, these are going to be hard ones for us to argue we should do. So even if you're going to come up with the conclusion, 11 through 20, that seems not right to me. Okay. But it could be right because he's looking at it, not me. Yeah, it could end at chapter 20. All right. You got to come on. I can't see these when you guys ask questions.
He said 17 through 26. That was Patterson.
Davin said, what about when people say that the quote men in Leviticus 18 was a purposeful mistranslation of quote boy, or is that a different passage? Quote, and then the second question, is that just made up?
That's First Corinthians, and it's not made up.
Go ahead and answer that, Josh. Say more because I need to read that. I can't understand the question. So if you understood the question, go ahead.
Yeah, it's in First Corinthians, and it's referring to pedophilia. So it's not that it's saying boy per se, Davin, but it's definitely not talking about. It's not condemning homosexual acts how we would perceive them. It's speaking to the first century people in Corinth about the problem of men sleeping with boys, and that was a common practice in first century. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that
Yeah,
was a common practice in first century Corinth. So it's pedophilia.
It
But
was
yeah,
the it was pederasty.
or pederasty. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, but he was talking about Leviticus 18. So, but maybe that's what he's remembering as Corinthians. Leviticus 18 doesn't say anything about a man. I mean, about a boy. So I don't know where that would come from. So it probably is talking about what Josh is talking about there. Or we can talk about it later. You can bring it back up in person and we can deal with that.
Patterson said the Leviticus is 16 through 20. No, 17 through 26. Is that?
Yeah, that sounds more right to me. Because I could have sworn it went into the high 20s. So anyway, so what do I want to say here in regard to this? My point was, before we got interrupted, was we don't want to use holiness codes. We want to be careful about using holiness code language to be theological for us today, unless you want to go back and do all the things with the clothing and the pork and the shellfish and all that other stuff. Okay, so we just want to be careful. Even if this is what that says, right? We want to be careful about whether it applies to us. So I looked at a few people, like John Boswell has argued these verses condemn specific pagan fertility rituals or cultic temple prostitution. Okay, so that's Boswell's argument and a lot of other people's argument there. Not same-sex relationships as we see them today. So Leviticus 18 isn't about, according to him, it's not about just relationships that we have, but it's about temple cultic prostitution. Okay, that's when these kinds of actions should not take place. So it has nothing to do with what we're dealing with specifically. Other scholars, if you read David Wright or if you read Robert Gagnon, they say, no, this applies more broadly to same-sex intercourse across the board. And it's based on creation norms. So they're going to go back to what Josh brought us back to before. So you just got to read these different scholars if you want to try and figure that stuff out. Renato Lings has explored a bunch of linguistic arguments dealing with these kinds of things and questions whether this can be universally, this can be a universal argument against same-sexuality. So read some of these guys if you care about it to get deeper into this. These words in Leviticus, a male lying with another male, are supposed to, they mean the same, like it's the same words that would talk about a male lying with a woman. But as you notice in this verse, there's nothing that says anything about women doing anything here. So I find that interesting. It's only males. Anybody see anything in this text that they want to mention? I want to deal with the next text, verse 23 as well, but maybe you've got something you want to say here. Okay.
Well, it sounds like it's a crime against creation. God created it to work one way, and man has, or women have changed the way they use it to not agree with God's intention.
Okay. So Tom, just tell me how that verse says what it is you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree with you. I'm just curious.
Lying with a man as you would with a woman.
Okay, just the fact that it contrasts one kind of sex with another kind of sex, and that's the negative part. It's contrasting.
Well, if you look at the parts, they're supposed to work one way.
Well, that's not in the text, but that's a fair.
That's common sense.
Okay, so yeah, so now we're arguing things again based on like the way, doesn't nature itself teach us that? That's a fine argument. Whether everyone agrees with it is another thing, but it is an argument. You can say, look, it obviously works, right? Okay, but I've heard arguments very similar, like, well, never mind. I don't need to get into some of the ridiculous arguments that I've heard on TikTok about, see, it's obvious, like the banana is made for us because it fits into our hands just in the right, exactly where our finger
It's
pieces are around the banana. So it's made for us to eat as like, so I guess the orange isn't made, anyway, there's just like, we can say that about almost anything we want.
There's an evangelical named Rachel Gilson, and she said she wrote a book called Born Again This Way, and she argues for the covenant relationship that God has with the church. Jesus is the bridegroom, church is the bride. She is not, she said she was born gay, and that instead of choosing celibacy, she chose to get married to a male and and not go with her instinct of being wanting to be with a woman to honor the covenant relationship that God has with the church. So that's another argument is that you either can be celibate or marry a male or if you're female and you're lesbian and you marry a male anyway, or if you're a male and gay or homosexual or whatever, you can marry a woman anyway to honor. So those are different arguments that I've heard.
Was she honoring God by that or honoring the community? What was her argument?
Honoring God's honoring the what she said she searched the scriptures, honoring what she felt the scriptures were speaking to about a male and woman in relationships. So kind of to where what Tom was talking about, which is that's the way it's supposed to be, or God's design. So the design, yeah, God's design. So yeah, but I can't answer that question. I don't really know.
Yeah. Okay.
I think
That's good.
part of the problem I would see with the argument would be that you're relegating sex to having one purpose, that being to create biological offspring. But sex has much more purposes than that by providing intimacy as the next most obvious. But like, sex isn't just about making kids. For a lot of us, we don't want any more kids, but we still want to have sex.
Right. Yeah. That's true. So it's just about pleasure. Yeah.
And I think too, I mean, I'm going to be rather crass, but if we're going to make arguments about what parts fit where, we all know that there are various holes that certain objects fit in, and it just
Right.
happens to be that the G spot for a man is in his butt, and we know what fits in there. So that seems, I mean, to Travis's point, that's not procreative, but it's intuitive. It seems natural in that sense. Like, I don't know. So I'm just saying, if we're going to play the where parts fit card, we should be honest about where parts fit.
Right. Yep.
Class.
Yeah, I didn't want to say that. I was heading in another direction. There are other places that things fit. And
That's why you're a pastor and I'm not.
against. That's right. I know. That's why I need you on here to say things that I'm not quite willing to say. Because my mom is listening, so I have to be very careful with what I say.
Do you know that the G spot's there by experience, Josh Patterson?
Enough of that. Enough of that. All right.
I do not. I do not.
All right, I'll keep it choked. All right, I'm sorry. I know this is serious. I'm sorry. I apologize to everybody, okay?
All right, verse 23. At least let's get done with 23. It continues. So we're still reading, right? 22 into 23. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. That is a perversion. So again, this is just to bring up what we started all this off with, right? There's a hierarchy. So women are mentioned here, but not in regard to sex with other women, but in regard to animals, right? And don't present yourself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. No prohibition here against lesbianism. Women's agency doesn't matter because they're just lower on the totem pole. They don't matter as much. So again, remember holiness code. Remember where women fit on this, and remember that the point of the holiness code is for priests. Remember, this is part of the P group. Remember our JEDP stuff that we've talked about many times. There's a Yahwistic group in the Pentateuch. There's an Elohist group. There's a Deuteronomist, and then there's a priestly group. And the priestly people come after the fact. They come late in that category, JEDP, in that particular way of thinking about things. This priestly class of people come and they take some of those texts and they add in things, they edit things for the priest. They're very concerned with ritual purity and holiness. None of us are priests. All right, so they're the ones who are going to add laws about when you can go into the Ark of the, to see the Ark of the Covenant, or when you go past certain curtains, or whether there are curtains, right, in the tabernacle or the temple or those kind of, they're the people who are going to add those pieces in there. This is what they care most about. So you could make some sort of argument that this is a rule for the priests in this area, or for the super holy among you, as if there are different classes. So people have said those things.
I think
We
that's
are all priests.
Yes, yeah, yes, but so is all of Israel called a priest. We just got to be careful that we don't just flatten things. We are all priests, as Paul, as later New Testament is going to talk about things, right? But Israel is a priest to the nations, but Israel has priests to them. And then there are higher priests that only get to go in once a year, right? There are still hierarchies of priests. So we are priests, but it's not an automatic connection to this. So we don't want to say, I assume, Tom, for instance, you don't want to say that all the rules that apply to priests back then apply to us today.
No.
Of course not.
But,
I mean,
but the point of priesthood is that we are an intermediary between God and other humans. And that's the Great Commission, which we are also indwelled by the Holy Spirit, which means we're in the presence of God 24/7.
right, but the rules that they had to, the rules,
purity thing still applies.
but it doesn't, right? Like, it doesn't really apply. It only applies in some new way.
When you sin, the Holy Spirit is right there witnessing it every bit, knows it, is hurt by it.
Sure, but what you're doing is you're spiritualizing the Old Testament and moving it into the New Testament, which is perfectly legitimate. But I don't think you think we have to wear an ephod all the time, right?
No.
We don't have to wear the certain thing. So we're not priests in the same way, but in an analogical way. So we don't have to follow all the ritual purity things. We don't have to wash our hands. We don't have to wait a certain amount of time before going. None of those things apply to us anymore. A different group of purity rituals might apply. But we'll have to figure that out. But it's an analogical connection. We aren't actually priests like they were priests. We're priests in a similar way, in that we mediate between God and man. That's true.
And even when they were priests, I bet there's stories of exceptions to the rules. Like from the point about like black and white, like we've talked here before, like the law is not black and white. Law is gray. I was looking at the law today about like what constitutes forcibly resisting law enforcement, because you have to forcibly resist. It's not just enough that you resist. And then they're like, well, it's not extreme forcible, but it's not slight forcible. It's modest forcible. And let's talk about what that looks like in this particular situation. That's how the law actually works. There are no black and white rules, or very, very few black and white rules.
Yeah, and we've talked about this when we've dealt with laws, right? Casuistic laws versus apodictic laws versus a proverbial way of understanding laws. So it's true today. It's true in the Bible as well. So that's a great point. But all the laws still require wisdom to navigate.
There was a priest that didn't wash his hands and did a sacrifice and didn't get killed, probably. Like at some point.
Yes. Yep. Probably very true.
I think an important thing that I've been looking at in these verses when it comes to who the target audience is, we can see that, okay, priestly types of things, but also with the end of verse 23, you see that it is giving instructions for women. Whereas verse 20 seems to be more male focused. You're talking about if you sleep with your neighbor's wife, then you'll defile yourself with her. You're not going to defile her because of hierarchy. And then you get to 22, once again, it's an abomination because of what the male is doing with the male. But then verse 23, it's like, just in case you thought this was all about only the priests, also there are rules for women where they fall.
Yes, let me add, that's a very good point. Very good point. Let me add, though, that when I say that it's a priestly code or when it's the holiness code, I don't mean all of the rules are just for priests. I mean they all deal with ritual impurity and in regard to when people can approach or touch certain things or be involved in ritual sacrifice or the cultic things that are involved in worship. So women also can come and worship, but they can only do so much. They can only get, so they have to also be cleansed and ritually, right? If they're like, if women are on their period, they can't go anywhere near anything important, anything sacred. So they have to wait a certain, they got to do the cleansing, they got to do all the practices. So this is another thing that keeps them from that purity area. So there's like a center of purity, and then there's cone outwards of what becomes less and less holy and more common. And those aren't sinful, those are just not holy anymore. So they become, it gets to the point of being immoral at some point as you get further away, but there are lots of categories within that. So just to say what you said, but to say it with a little bit more precision about the holiness code. All right. We're at 9:07. We can do the other Leviticus one, but we'll definitely go over, and I'm not willing to do that. So does anybody else want, since I talked for the first 30 minutes without stopping, anybody else want to throw something in here that we might tackle later? Who knows? Or we tackle it now?
There's a parallel approach to considering the Old Testament rules applying somewhat in the New Testament, because Jesus himself said that he did not come to change the law.
Well, to be fair, he says that in Matthew.
Correct.
But in Hebrews, it says that he does. So, I mean, we just gotta do what we can with all these texts, right? And Hebrews says that the law has been abolished. And Matthew specifically says that from Jesus' own mouth, I have not come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it. And Hebrews says, yeah, he came to abolish it. It's the same word. We'll have to figure out what to do with that. Again, they're doing different things with that. We got to be careful not to be just to quote a verse and like that settles it, because there's always another verse that takes us a different direction and just makes it a little less clear. Even if there's an answer, I'm not pretending there's not an answer, but it's not as clear as we think it is.
I assume we're going to continue this next week.
Yes, sir. We are. Whether we continue into Leviticus 20 or not is still a question, because I need to talk with my professor friend, my New Testament professor friend, and see if he's willing, when he's willing to do it. If he can do it in a few weeks, we'll keep going and then let him come back and take apart all the things that I said and go his direction, which I think would be really helpful to see, all right, this is the direction Jace is thinking about, and here's the way that he's doing it in a completely different way and with different answers. And that will really help us to think. So one day I'm going to do something that I'm really good at, that I understand, and we're going to have like two people on at the same time that we can kind of debate back and forth. But I'm always just doing a little bit more research than you've done, and I'm not really in this higher category of knowledge. So especially in this, I read about 20 books on the subject. That's as much as I know. It isn't very much. All right. Well, it's 9:10. We usually have an after party where we can hang out and you can say things that aren't recorded. So I'm going to let that happen now. And now Josh Patterson can say all the things he really wanted to say.